Hello Year 10. This video will help you to catch up on anything you missed over the last couple of lessons and will help you to do your homework on the Spartacist Uprising and the Kapp Putsch. Before we start, you need to have your Germany workbook and you need to have information 2.12 in front of you. If you haven't already got that, pause the video and go and grab it. So at the moment, as you know, we're working on the big story of the Weimar Republic, and we're working on the first part of this story, the early years of the Weimar Republic, when the Weimar Republic was very unstable. Now in particular, in this video, we are going to focus on two of the early challenges for the Weimar Republic. We're going to look at the Spartacist Uprising and the Kapp Putsch, and we're going to see how two groups of extremists tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic. So the first group that we're going to look at are called the Spartacists, and in 1919 they tried to overthrow the Weimar Republic in an event which we call the Spartacist Uprising. Let's look at what happened. To understand this uprising, we need to know a little bit about the background to it. And the background was what had happened in Russia in the year 1917. There, a communist revolution had taken place. Communists in Russia, led by this man, Lenin, had seized power. They had overthrown the government and begun to set up the world's first communist country. As part of this, they began to redistribute or share out land, property and wealth. Now, the Spartacists in Germany wanted to copy what had happened in Russia. They wanted to carry out a communist revolution in Germany. They were led by these two, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. And in 1919 they began a workers' uprising on the streets of Germany. They encouraged workers to come out in large numbers and protest against the government. This turned into an uprising against the government, and the Spartacists seized control of some of the key buildings in Berlin, including the government newspaper buildings and telegraph buildings. Now, before we go any further, I want you to pause the video and read Case Study A about the Spartacist Uprising. In particular, I want you to look for any reasons why the Spartacist Uprising failed. When you've done this and underlined the reasons, you can hit play again. Okay, let's see how you got on. So there are a number of reasons here as to why the Spartacist Uprising failed. Here's the first one. The leadership of the Spartacist Uprising was disorganised and divided. They were not entirely sure whether to fight the government or to negotiate with the government. And as a result, this led them to hesitate. This was a big mistake, because while they were hesitating and trying to decide what to do, many of the workers left the uprising and went home. And that meant that the Spartacists missed their opportunity to seize control of the other government buildings. There are some other reasons why the Spartacist uprising failed as well. Another reason was that the Chancellor Ebert, was ruthless in the way that he dealt with the uprising. He called in the army, and he also called in the Freikorps, a group of paramilitaries, to crush the uprising. And they crushed it ruthlessly. There were heavy casualties. Another reason why the uprising failed is that many of the workers taking part in the uprising lacked weapons, and that made it easier for the army and the Freikorps to crush them. And lastly, the army and the Freikorps not only crushed the uprising, but they also murdered the leaders of the Spartacists. and this meant that the uprising no longer had leadership. This made it easier for the uprising to be crushed. If you've missed some of those reasons, you need to annotate your text and underline them. Now you're ready for the first part of 2.13. You need to fill in this first column on the tick chart for the Spartacists. Pause the video here, have a go, and when you're ready, hit play. Okay, let's look at the answers. Here's what you should have ticked. You need to pause the video again now and check your answers. Correct any that you got wrong. When you're ready, hit play again. Okay, now let's look at the second of our case studies. This one is called the Kapp Putsch, and it took place in 1920. Now, the group that did this were called the Freikorps. They were units of armed ex-soldiers. We would call them paramilitaries. They had returned from the First World War with their weapons and their equipment. Now, these Freikorps units had grown very big. There were about 250,000 Freikorps by 1920, and Chancellor Ebert began to worry that they were out of control. So, Ebert ordered them to disband. He tried to shut them down. The Freikorps refused, and instead they decided to overthrow the government. And that's what we call the Kapp Putsch. So what happened? Well, Freikorps units led by this man, Wolfgang Kapp, occupied key parts of Berlin, the capital city. It was no longer safe for the Weimar government to be there, so they fled from the city. Ebert asked the army to crush the Freikorps, but they refused. The army was unwilling to fire on the Freikorps because the Freikorps were ex-soldiers. Now, in the end, the Kapp Putsch also failed. It's time for you to read case study B, so I need you to pause the video now and do that. While you're reading, I want you to underline or highlight any reasons you can see why the Kapp Putsch failed. When you're done, press play and we'll have a look at how you got on. Okay, let's look and see. So hopefully you've spotted that this time around the Kapp Putsch fails because of the actions of the workers. The workers of Germany, and especially the factory workers in Berlin, went on strike. This means they laid down their tools and refused to work. This was a large strike involving workers not just from Berlin but across the country, about 12 million of them. And because the factories were no longer working, the city of Berlin ground to a halt with no transport, power or water. And that meant that Kapp and the Freikorps were unable to rule. There's another reason why the putsch failed too. You might have noticed that the civil servants, these are the government officials, refused to cooperate with Kapp or help him, and so it was impossible for him to govern. The final reason why this putsch failed is that Kapp himself fled when he realised that this could not succeed. And when that happened, the putsch no longer had its leader, so the putsch collapsed and the Weimar government returned to Berlin. And now you're ready to complete the second column on your tick chart. This time around, I want you to tick which of the features apply to the Kapp Putsch. Pause the video and do this, and when you're ready, hit play. Okay, let's check those answers. Here they are. Remember to correct yours if you got any wrong. So your final job is the last part of task 2.13. Here we're going to practice our technique at explaining. The question we're going to work on is this one. explain why the Weimar Republic was able to survive challenges from the left and the right in the period 1919 to 23. This means we can explain how the Weimar Republic survived the Spartacist uprising, which was a left-wing uprising, or we can explain how the Weimar Republic survived challenges from the right wing. This means the Kapp Putsch. Now, in your answer, I'm looking for one PEE paragraph. I want you to show that you have some detailed knowledge of the uprisings, and I want you to produce a developed explanation. And you can see I've given you some phrases, including some explaining connectives, which you can use. I've also given you some hints on what paragraph topics you might write about. For example, you could write a paragraph about how ruthless Ebert was in crushing the Spartacist uprising. You could write about how the Freikorps helped to crush the Spartacist uprising. You could write about the role of the army and how they helped to crush the Spartacist uprising. You could write about how the support of the workers and the trade unions helped to put an end to the Kapp Putsch. And the one that I'm going to model for you is this last one here, because my paragraph is going to be about the poor leadership and organisation of the Spartacist uprising. So here's my model paragraph. As you can see, I've started with a big point. My big point addresses the question. I've begun it with one reason why the Weimar Republic survived, and then I've introduced a reason that my paragraph will focus on, the leadership and organisation of the Spartacists. The next step is for me to provide some evidence of the Spartacist uprising and to explain why it failed. So here you can see my evidence. I've given some details about the Spartacist uprising. For example, I've explained when it happened, who led it, why they did it, and what they did. In the next part of my paragraph, I've produced a little explanation of why the uprising failed. Now you'll notice that I'm taking my time to explain that in detail, and I'm using some explaining connectives in order to do that. So as you can see, I've used the following: as a result, consequently, as a result, and so. And this is what you should do in your paragraph. I'm looking for a really developed logical explanation of how the Weimar Republic survived. Now remember, you cannot write about poor leadership and organisation because I've already done that one. But you could write about any of the other reasons. Remember, you only need to write about one of them. So don't try and include them all in your paragraph. Pick one and focus on that.